friends. Welcome to another episode of the Healthier Podcast. I'm your host, Reena Jadhav, on a mission to help you live the healthiest and happiest you've ever lived before. 2020 is a brand spanking new year, and I've got an amazing guest and a book interview today for you. So the book is called The Switch. Ta-da! It is Ignite Your Metabolism with Intermittent Fasting, Protein Cycling, and Keto. But I'll tell you what, the title does not do it justice. The switch, in my perspective, having read the book, is truly at the heart of helping us understand how the body works so that we can make smarter decisions about the information coming at us. After all, we've all heard keto is good, keto is bad. Intermittent fasting is great, not for women. Protein cycling, what the heck's that anyway? Well, we're going to find out. We're going to talk to James Clement in just a few moments. So James has a fascinating history. He is not a traditional MD scientist that I typically have on as my guest. He's actually an entrepreneur turned research scientist who has focused on the science of lifespan and longevity. And he's written this book. He's very famous for having done the supercentenarian research study that he did with another scientist from Harvard Medical School. He's now based in Florida, Gainesville. He's got a lab where he's busy trying to find the next molecule that's going to help us live a very, very long life, disease-free, which is the key. Now, here are some things that famous people have to say about this book. Now, some of these people you'll recognize because I've hosted them on my own show. David Sinclair is one, and if you haven't heard David Sinclair, check it out. It was an incredible interview. This is what David says. I was blown away by this book. James Clement has produced the best book I've read on fasting and autophagy. Definitely worth the read. And I said, as I said before, if you're curious about the truth about fasting or completely confused about what's the right time to do fasting, when should I eat, how should I eat, this is going to be a great interview for you to listen into or watch. David Perlmutter, New York Times bestselling author, MD, this is what he has to say. The switch will undoubtedly rewrite your health destiny. Wow. Of course, this is only if you implement what you listen today. So hopefully you'll not only listen to this, but you'll implement a lot of what he's proposing, if not all of it. Mark Hyman, all of our favorite functional medicine doc out there. James Clement is a rare trailblazer in scientific circles. This is a must read. All right, let's get on with the interview. First question, why did you write the book and why the switch? What is the switch for those who haven't read the book?
Sure. For the last 20 years, I've really been focusing my own work on longevity science, the biology of aging. And one of the interventions that is probably the most well-documented health span and lifespan increasing thing that can be done in organisms or humans is called calorie restriction. And there's some variations of it. Protein restriction has been done in animal models. Certainly lots of experiments recently in fasting, prolonged fasting and intermittent fasting, and a growing interest in the ketogenic diet. So back in 2013, knowing this, I decided to try and figure out if there was one mechanism of action, that is what these different nutritional practices were doing in cells, and whether this was going to be additive. So for example, could you restrict your calories by 20%, restrict your proteins in a certain way, fast frequently, and take certain anti-aging drugs? Would all those things be additive? And you'd get like this tremendous health increase and dramatic longevity, or are they simply working in the same pathway and they would, in a sense, cancel each other out to some degree? So over the course of about a year, I read about 2,000 scientific papers just in this one area. And what I basically discovered was that there was a metabolic switch referred to as MTOR, which we can get into later, but that this switch was involved in nearly every single disability that occurs with old age and with every life extension therapy that we knew about, from various anti-cancer nutraceuticals to many different types of drugs, as well as practices involving longevity practiced all over the world by different peoples.
Actually dive right into MTOR because you mentioned that that is the switch. I love the simplicity of the way you explained it. You know, your switch is either on or off. If it's on, you're growing, which is great at a certain age, right? When you're young, you want to grow. When it's off, you're cleaning, you're repairing. And so after a certain age, you don't want to be growing. You don't want to age too fast. You want to be cleaning and repairing. I love that simplicity. However, let's dive into the details of what is the switch? How'd you find it? How does the Easter Island have anything to do with this? Because that's your chapter 1.
That's right. It is actually a really interesting story as to how this molecule inside our cells was discovered. And it happened because of a drug that was found. And it was found in the soil of an island called Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. That's the one that has those monolithic statues on it that you might have seen. And Canadian researchers went there, took soil samples, and discovered a bacteria that made a antimicrobial substance, which they named after the island. So it was called rapamycin. And they noted that it had all kinds of interesting properties. So it slowed cell growth. And among the types of cells that it slowed growth and sometimes completely inhibited the growth were cancer cells. So the NIH got very interested in this compound as well. And a lot of effort and money was put into discovering how is this working. And I detail in the book very briefly the fact that someone looking at what went on with using an electron microscope actually found this complex, and the complex, which had never been before been known inside cells, they named after this drug. So it was called the target of rapamycin, TOR. And because it was discovered in bacteria, this was a very simple complex. But when they started looking for it in vertebrates and then later mammals, they found that it was much more of a complex set of pathways and proteins. And so they changed the name first to mammalian target of rapamycin. And then when they discovered it was in all vertebrates, not just mammals, they changed it to mechanistic target of rapamycin. But it's commonly called MTOR. And so without having discovered MTOR, which really came about in the 1990s, this knowledge about how this switch operates and how it switches between two states of the cell, an anabolic state and a catabolic state, this would never have been known. And one of the interesting things is when you read a lot about nutrition, and a lot of people like to talk about the McGovern hearings and how our modern food pyramid came about. All of this research was done in the 70s. So they had absolutely no knowledge about this metabolic switch. And I think that's very telling when it comes to what kind of suggestions have been made over the numerous decades since that time.
And it's exciting that there's over 1,300 clinical trials for use of rapamycin for things like Crohn's, which is starting to become an epidemic, to other degenerative diseases. So it's exciting possibilities that I think we have in the next coming years where rapamycin might be able to be used as a potential drug. Going back to why does rapamycin work, you say that it works primarily because it initiates autophagy. So let's talk about that. What is autophagy and why do we want it?
Sure. So mTOR was essentially a survival mechanism that evolved in bacteria. All organisms need nutrients, and nature doesn't provide nutrients on an even basis. So Sometimes you have feast and sometimes you have famine. And the bacteria that had this TOR mechanism were able to stop making so many proteins and stop cell division, and basically to hunker down during famine and to get some of their resources from inside their own cells. And it was through a process called autophagy. And this process I described metaphorically as little garbage trucks inside your cell that go around and selectively pick out really bad things. So misfolded proteins and organelles like your mitochondria, which produce power for your cells. And your cells are full of hundreds, if not thousands of mitochondria, and some of them are dysfunctional. And so it takes those and it brings them to something called the lysosome, which is basically like a big recycling center. It's full of enzymes and acid, and these little dump trucks dump their load into it, and it dissolves them back into their basic constituents, some of which is waste, and some of which are amino acids that get put back into the cell to make as proteins. So this mechanism allowed those bacteria to out-survive all of the bacteria that didn't have TOR. And all plants and all animals evolved having this complex. And what I believe is that the more long-lived mammal organisms, and certainly us, made use of this complex in our longevity. So this getting rid of misfolded proteins and high free radical producing mitochondria is an essential part of our health and longevity. And as I'll talk about later in the book, this goes completely awry in modern society.
And that's why you talk about, and this is chapter 2, by the way. So in chapter 2, you talk pretty significantly about how to induce autophagy, because clearly you demonstrated up until then how critical it is and how it's linked to decreasing inflammation, preventing cancers. In fact, to quote you, why cancers and neurological diseases have increased dramatically during the 25th century. I mean, you're even claiming that poor autophagy, which in some sense comes from the fact that we became a snacking society with very easy access to limitless food that clearly was not nutritionally very strong, is one of the reasons why we've ended up with these degenerative diseases, is because we're not giving our bodies the time that it needs and the nutrition it needs, or the deprivation of nutrition to allow it to do this cleansing process. So let's dive into, all right, tell us, James, how do we create autophagy? What are the key things that we need to do?
So this MTOR metabolic switch, which switches between anabolism, or the anabolic state, which is by scientists referred to as the fed state. Mm-hmm. It switches between that and the non-fed or nutrient-deprived state, in which catabolism, this catabolic state, is turned on, and autophagy is upregulated, meaning that it's turned on as well, and it goes into this process of clearing bad things out. In this pathway are what are referred to as nutrient sensors, and they're fed into another protein complex called AMPK, and those nutrients include the amount of insulin that you have in your bloodstream, and insulin is primarily regulated by the amount of glucose you have. So carbohydrates have a huge impact on whether this one sensor that tells mTOR whether or not it should be off or on is in one state or the other. Other sensors include branched chain amino acids. So if you have proteins like leucine, isoleucine, or valine, those will also tell mTOR that it's okay to make more cells, to grow, and stay in this anabolic state. And the final major sensor is simply oxygen. The cell needs to respire, It's part of how we make energy through the mitochondria is with oxygen. And so if you're in a hypoxic state, mTOR gets turned off also. And I talk about that in a later chapter as well.
And specifically, what are the dietary recommendations? Because you talk about high fat, high fiber, low carb, and minimal protein. And we're going to talk about that at length because I don't know if you've gone to a grocery store lately and seen sort of aisles upon aisles of protein bars and protein shakes and protein smoothies. And now we've got protein water, by the way. So it seems like very contrary to what's being sold to us, which is, hey, you need more protein. You're arguing that in fact it's quite the opposite. Protein will activate your mTOR and you don't want that. Talk a little bit about that.
Certainly. And this is actually one of the main reasons why I wanted to write the book, was because once you learn about mTOR and what turns on mTOR, specifically high blood sugar levels plus certain amino acids, then no matter what you hear in terms of someone's marketing or maybe another diet book or another science book in which they focus on one particular thing. So it's easy to sort of get misled. We could talk about sarcopenia, which is basically the loss of muscle mass. And it's easy to say, elderly people don't get enough protein. Therefore, why don't you start young and keep your protein levels really high all the time, and you won't have, or you'll lower your risk of sarcopenia. That sounds totally logical, except if you know about the switch, then what you're realizing is, okay, I'm going to keep the switch in this growth state forever. I'm never turning on repair mechanisms, and that can't be good for me. So unfortunately, it's in the interest of a lot of companies to sell a product, and they look for, what's the best way to sell a protein bar? Well, it's to tell people that you need protein and you need more than you think you're getting, and therefore to, encourage you to buy their product. But unfortunately, this is not how we evolved. We evolved, humans in particular, to go through many feasts and famine, certainly not to have a refrigerator full of high energy foods that we could go to and a reason to stay up, whether it's nighttime television or, the fact that many of us work all night now, you could essentially eat well past dark, all the way up to bed, and then wake up the next morning and do the very same thing. And so learning about this feast and famine and whether or not you should be eating protein, how much sugar is good for you, how does this all work? This was one of the main reasons for writing this particular part of the book. And I do delve into things like glycogen, which is the way your body stores glucose. So the liver and your muscle hold most of the glycogen. And those levels of glycogen in the body basically tell the body whether or not to produce insulin. And then that level of insulin is one of the main things that controls mTOR and what state it's going to be in.
You also talk about the importance of exercise for autophagy. What kind of exercise, how much? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, certainly there's lots of reasons to exercise, having nothing to do with just anabolic versus catabolic state. But what we do find is that one of the triggers for turning on catabolism is lower energy levels. And a great way on a daily basis of lowering your energy level is through healthy exercise. So you get lots of additional benefits, but by using up your glycogen stores, by doing, going to the gym and doing a treadmill or going out for a run or doing some heavy weightlifting, is that this helps deplete your glycogen stores so that when you stop eating in the evening and begin to fast, you don't go into the evening with completely full reserves so that you can make it all the way to the next morning and your next meal without ever dipping into this catabolic state. You want to go into the evening with depleted reserves, so that overnight your body switches into this catabolic state. And this is definitely how people evolved, and I do talk about that quite a bit.
So in chapter 3, you talk about dwarfs and mutants, but really in essence, you're trying to educate us about IGF-1 and its critical importance and the body's built-in anti-aging molecule. So tell everybody, what is IGF-1 and why should we care about it?
IGF-1 is a molecule that is a signaling molecule. It's very associated with insulin. It's called insulin-like growth factor, and it helps regulate the body's anabolic state. This determination of as to whether or not mTOR is going to be on, primarily influenced by insulin itself, not just IGF-1, is through a receptor that measures both insulin levels and IGF-1 levels. And some of the really interesting tie-ins to why keeping mTOR turned down at times could be really important to health is illustrated by people who have loss of function mutations in this IGF-1 area. So it could either be that they produce less IGF-1 or their receptor is impaired, so that no matter how much they signal, it just doesn't send this on to the mTOR side. So Laurent syndrome people basically suffer from this impaired receptor. They have plenty of growth hormone, but they still don't advance beyond dwarf stage. And yet they are completely impervious to diabetes and cancer. They have much lower levels of heart disease and Alzheimer's. And unfortunately, for other reasons, they don't necessarily have longer lifespan than we have, but it's primarily tied into other lifestyle habits of theirs. But we also see this in nature with miniatures. So we've learned now that it's a single gene mutation that makes the difference between a full-size dog like a Doberman pincer and its miniature pincer cousin. And yet we see that the Doberman lives about 9 years on average, and a miniature pincer can live 12, 13, 14 years or more. And this is true in all the dwarf or miniature versions that we found. Many mice, for scientific laboratory purposes, have been bred as dwarfs, and they all have extraordinarily longer lifespans and health spans than the full-size version. I went around and collected blood samples from people who were 110 years and older for a number of years, working with Professor George Church at Harvard Medical School. And one of the things that I noticed about these people who I met in person was that very few of the women were over 5'2". Many of them, just barely 5 foot. Many of the men were very diminutive as well. So I think that this loss of function mutations, which have now been found in the genetics of both centenarians and supercentenarians, also shows us how important keeping your IGF-1 levels low is to regulating the switch in the anabolic and catabolic state.
Absolutely. Moving on to chapter 4, which I thought was a fascinating chapter because you give us insights into how to decrease our calorie count. Okinawans, monks, and Seventh-day Adventists, kind of your core message there is, we're eating too many calories. We've really all got to cut down how many calories we eat. And my question is, how do you decide how much calorie is the right calorie amount for someone, given how varied we are as humans? We have different lifestyles. So help us understand, first of all, where does the science come from for lower caloric intake, but also how does someone listening to this or watching this figure out what that looks like for us?
Sure. So a Cornell professor named Clive McKay in the 1930s did the first experiments on rats, I believe, where he restricted their calories by about 20% of what they would eat if just allowed to eat as much as they want. And he found a fairly dramatic increase in health span, meaning that they didn't succumb to uh, diseases of aging as they got older, but also just median lifespan increased as well. And lots of studies have followed since the 1930s. They varied it in many ways. They've restricted different proteins, seeing what about cutting calories is actually doing this. Because one possibility is just you turn the cell's metabolism down by cutting calories, and that's why people live longer. And what they found was you can actually ratchet up the calories by double. Like under a ketogenic diet, you could go from 2,000 to 4,000 calories, and you would still get the health span benefits, which was a really interesting finding. And that led to the discovery that it's actually proteins that were being reduced. And so calorie restriction is a very simple way. You just across the board cut your calories, but mainly you have to cut the proteins. And in fact, there's an organization called the Calorie Restriction Society, and a group of those members had been doing something called Crone, where they tried to optimize their nutrition and actually increase their protein activity intake while they were restricting their calories. And Walter Longo and other people tested them and discovered that they weren't actually getting the full benefits of calorie restriction by supplementing with protein and increasing their protein levels in an effort they thought to be more healthy. They were actually turning off the switch. So there's been a lot of evidence to show that cutting calories is one way of doing it. Cutting protein is another way of doing it. Reducing your glycogen stores and exercising and reducing your energy levels before bedtime is another great way of turning on this switch. So what I really like to focus on is that it's all about the different ways of turning off and on the switch. Right. It's not that you have to do calorie restriction or that you have to become a vegan, that you can't eat meat anymore, but simply that when you want MTOR turned off and you want this repair turned on, you need to pick something that does that and to follow that practice.
And I think that's where each of us is different, and it's a question of figuring out what works for you best. So trying different mechanisms and saying, hey, maybe someone enjoys caloric restriction, someone else prefers intermittent fasting, someone else doesn't even care if their protein goes down to negligible. So it's, I always say, try and find something that works for you long-term, because again, a big part of your message is this isn't a fad short-term thing. This is a lifestyle. You're adopting, in essence, a brand new lifestyle, because your program talks about sort of an annual based program. So guys, this is not a 10-day, 14-day, 3-day program. This is truly a new way of thinking of your body, your health, and how you want to live to 100 without disease. Because again, none of us wants to live to 100 with disease. But if we could live to 100 plus without disease, now that's exciting. I want to talk about something that I was real surprised. I've done at this point about 112 interviews, and I didn't know this, that protein stimulates insulin release. We're always told it's carbs that are linked to insulin, and you make a fact that actually protein does the exact same thing. And so I had to go in and clean out my my pantry and throw out the variety of protein wrapped food products that I had purchased based on some of the other works that I had read or listened to. In addition to that, I loved some of your examples on caloric restriction, James. I'm going to share two because they were so surprising and so easy to do. I thought, hey, if this is something that our viewers can do very easily and get rid of some calories, why not? So one of them was the fact that slow down when you eat. you'll consume 300 fewer calories per meal, according to a study in the Journal of American Dietetic Association. So that's about 500 calories in a day just from slowing down. Now, I know the pace of life that all of us lead, slowing down may be hard, but it may be worth it. So making some time and really putting down sort of, what do you say when you say slowing down? Taking an hour to eat a meal, what does that translate into?
It's basically giving your body time to send feedback signals to you, telling you that you've satiated your hunger. Because if you eat really fast, your body reacts to that very slowly. So you'll overconsume more often than not, simply because you're not getting that signal yet from your brain saying, I've eaten enough.
Right, right. The second one that I thought was so critical, and of course my kids are going to hear about this, put away your phone. And the data is, it's again a study by the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. People who looked at their phone during lunch, not even were on the phone, apparently didn't remember their meal as well, felt less full, and snacked to the tune of 200 more calories per day. So checking out your phone, just looking at your phone during lunch, may cause you to eat 200 more calories. What a simple, easy way to get those calorie levels down. And I think your proposal is figure out how to get about 500 or so calories out of your daily meal. And these are two very simple tips, slow down your eating, maybe say a little prayer right before you start to take up some more time. Don't rush into work right away. Just take a couple of minutes to settle in. And second of all, don't look at your phone. So those are some wonderful tips. There's a lot more tips, by the way, working out before breakfast. You've got a lot of other great tips. So for those of you interested, definitely go ahead and check out the book. I'm going to delete some of this stuff. Let's talk about dairy. You've got a whole section. You've got angst against milk and dairy. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, if you think about it, so one of the things I discovered when I was looking at this molecular switch and the fact that it was turned on primarily by one branch chain amino acid named leucine, was that leucine is found in all breast milk. And it makes sense that you would want a baby to grow and to grow quickly. In the case of human breast milk versus cow's breast milk, though, they have 4 times the level of leucine. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, well, when we look at paleo history, when we look at peoples around the planet that still live a very ancestral lifestyle, we see women carry their children around for 4 or 5 years after they're born. And in fact, they usually don't have a second child later than those who don't carry their children around. And cows obviously can't protect their children. They have to grow quickly and be able to keep up with the herd, be able to move quickly into the center of the herd if they're attacked by a predator. And so it really makes sense that calves would have much more of this anabolic, growth-oriented branched chain amino acid than humans. And yet, what do humans do? We drink milk our entire lives. Whether it's a glass of milk at the table, or ice cream, or dairy that's found in lots of food, including those protein bars probably, is that we're probably the only animal on Earth that consumes breast milk after we've reached puberty. So it does seem a little odd. It's a great way of turning on MTOR and knowing that it's turned on. So I'm actually a fan myself of taking HMB, which is a metabolite of leucine, or taking whey protein. Leucine is this one particular branched chain amino acid. It's found primarily in dairy, and so it's concentrated in cheese. And if you eat a lot of hard cheeses, especially, then you're always going to have mTOR turned on, even if your glycogen levels are low, because this one branch chain amino acid can sort of override things and tell the cell, you know, it's okay to make more copies of yourself. We've got lots of amino acids.
Talk about protein cycling, because we haven't actually had you define that yet. And in some sense, that's, again, something that you've been a big proponent of, is protein cycling. What is it?
So one of the ways to very easily cycle mTOR between these two states of anabolism and catabolism is to vary your protein intake. So you can reduce it down quite dramatically, and plant material has much, much lower levels of leucine. So if, for example, you want to go very low protein, then just switch to an all plant diet for, you know, days or weeks or however you want to inhibit mTOR. And when you want it back on, then it's good to consume a lot more proteins. And you can do this with plants, but you'd have to focus on high protein value foods like grains, and legumes like you know, beans and other high protein nuts and things like that. So the way to turn it off and on through protein cycling is a very simple mechanism for turning this back one way or the other.
Next chapter, which is chapter 5, where you talk about epileptic children and world-class cyclists, you get into ketogenic. And of course, there is a lot of information out there about keto, and on the very top of that is that it's a meat-centric diet. You know, a lot of the old recipes talked about chicken and bacon, and that's not what you're talking about. So first, tell us about what have you learned about keto, and then let's dive into the type of keto that you recommend.
Absolutely. So again, it's entirely possible to have a very healthy ketogenic lifestyle and to both turn on autophagy and turn it back off and go into the growth state, all the while that you're doing keto. But you have to have enough glycogen to do this, and you have to have enough protein to do this during the anabolic state, and you have to be able to limit that protein when you want to go into the catabolic state. So I see lots of discussions about the paleo diet where they simply talk about eating lots of meat, and then for the people that are used to desserts and, you know, sort of can't live without it, you see tons of recipes for, you know, pies made with almond flour and honey and all kinds of things which could obviously keep mTOR turned on just as easily as using sugar instead of honey. The fact that it was available to Paleolithic man doesn't really prevent the switch from being turned on. So one of my points of talking about the ketogenic diet is that it's really useful. And I think it's an absolutely great weight loss tool because as long as your glycogen stores are full, which you get when you're on a high carbohydrate diet, or at least a high glycemic carbohydrate diet, then you never burn fat, because part of this switch to the catabolic state is that you tell your cells to start burning fat and to start saving glucose, which it'll do in the liver and muscles, and try and replenish those stores that it has. But if you're trying to lose weight, you really need to be able to turn this switch into the catabolic state, or else you'll only ever grow fat. You'll never burn it. And obviously, there's lots of good reasons to want to burn fat. It's actually more efficient in the mitochondria, produces less free radicals, which means it's less immunogenic, cause less cancer, etc. It's one of the reasons why being on a keto diet seems to be very beneficial as an anti-tumorigenic lifestyle.
And it fits into your basic switch theory, which is your switch is either on or off. And so the ketogenic diet, in essence, is really switching off the growth and switching on the cleansing. By reusing all the stores that are excess. All that excess sugar and fat that's sitting around your body is getting consumed and used up. So again, logically, I think I love how this book really simplified, in my mind at least, the equation of why keto, or as we're now going to talk about, paleo. So your next chapter, you talk about paleo, you introduce paleo and the hunter-gatherer, which is the caveman and industrialist, your chapter 6. So again, paleo, lots of different books, lots of different perspectives, some good, some clearly incorrect, according to you. So talk a little bit about what is truly paleo and why are you so against farming?
Yeah, at times it does sound like I'm against most things, but what I'm really focused on is teaching people how to turn off and turn on this switch on a cyclic basis, because you need it on sometimes. You need to grow muscle, you need to repair your organs. Your stem cell growth is regulated by this very same switch. So is your immune system. So it needs to be on from time to time, but you also have to repair your cells, and that requires the catabolic side of the switch being on from time to time. So again, looking at Paleolithic nutrition, there's lots of evidence now that really there is no one Paleolithic diet. It sort of depended on what group of people you were studying, where they were located. If you look at Northern Europe, well, Paleolithically, they were in an ice age for 20,000 years. So of course, they're not going to be a group of people that were primarily living off of vegetation. They were killing giant mammals of the types that are now extinct because of those activities. There were woolly rhinos in the UK, giant sloths and mammoths on the continent. And those all disappeared during the Ice Age, and it's primarily believed that humans, led to their demise by eating them. And so it depends. If you look at caves in France, you'll find lots of evidence of eating primarily animals for nutrition. If you go to other places of the world, Africa, Middle East, etc., then you see that they were primarily eating tubers and grasses and other plant material, as much as 70 or 80% of their calories coming from that, and only a small amount from wildlife. So I think one of the things to learn and to differentiate between what's paleo and what's not is to think about how much agriculture has changed just in the last 150 years. And so I did a lot of reading about the change on the industrial side. So the switch from stone mills to iron mills, and how everyone loved white flour, and that became the predominant flour that was shipped all over the world by industrialized companies. So if you look at the levels of consumption of flour and sugar, and Lustig, for one, has done a fantastic job of showing how dramatically sugar went up from a pound a year to over 100 pounds a year per person in consumption over a 100-year period. You look at all of these changes. Refrigeration, for example, allowed for us to preserve fruits, plants, dairy, things like that you wouldn't have found in abundance before the invention of refrigeration. Also, the fact that we could now grow things in all parts of the world, refrigerate or freeze it, and ship it to other parts of the world. So we lost this inherited lifestyle of seasonally eating different things. And again, if you look at Paleolithic man, there was probably very little incentive to stay up late after dark. You certainly didn't want to be outside the area that you lived and walking around at night, because predators are very good at night seeing and humans are not. And so this invention of um, whale oil used to light lanterns, and then later electricity to light our homes, street lights, etc. It basically made for 24 hours a day. A person could be up and active and relatively safe. And so we see lots of our lifestyle affected by modernity, and this idea that things are becoming more and more industrialized. And I also talk about livestock. I grew up on a farm. It was my grandfather's farm. My parents were not farmers, but I saw pasture-fed cows and pasture-fed hogs, and he had a chicken coop, which was mostly um, the fact that they could go out in the daytime and pick around this enormous farm, and at night they'd scoot back to the coop and roost and lay their eggs. Um, but now we have these giant CAFOs, concentrated animal farming operations, where multitudes of thousands of cows or pigs or chickens are raised in very small lots or buildings, and sometimes even without light, and fed mostly high omega-6 oil-based grains to fatten them up. And basically the practice is for all of these animals is to intentionally give them diabetes, because diabetes helps makes people obese. And so if you want an animal to put on a lot of weight, you make them obese and you make them diabetic. So we're eating very different foods than people ate even 150 years ago. So I try to go through all of these changes and to explore why paleo, in a broad sense, is really the way we should be eating, and that we can't let these modern conveniences disturb this switch the way it has.
Let's talk about the problem with sugar, as you call it, and let's actually clear out some confusion. We have a lot of people calling it in or messaging us and saying, should I be eating fruit? I shouldn't be eating fruit. Should I be eating honey? Isn't that sugar? But what about fructose? I heard fructose is really bad as well. Versus, of course, no one will argue with you that, okay, table sugar is bad. So we know processed sugar is bad, but what about jaggery? So talk a little bit about what has your research led you to conclude about sugar? And again, what percentage of sugar do we need to take in our diets in order to put the switch off?
When I really started diving into MTOR and this switch, and realizing that glucose levels affected insulin levels, which thus turned off and on this switch, I started taking my blood sugar every day. So first thing upon waking, I bought one of these inexpensive blood glucose monitors, and over the course of seeing what was happening with my fasting, I took more and more. So for probably 2 years straight, I took maybe 5 to 10 glucose tests a day, because I was really curious about what is it that's causing my fasting glucose to be so different day to day. And then I saw that some of the things that I was snacking on, or some of the things that I was drinking, were really dramatically affecting my blood sugar. And
Can you give an example of a couple of those?
sure. So I decided, I had cut out sugar in general, like table sugar, from my diet years before, for various health reasons. But I was using sugar substitutes. But if you notice, a lot of sugar substitutes utilize something called maltodextrin as a filler, because if you were just looking at saccharose or aspartame or something like that, it would be like stevia, for example. Only the tip of a matchstick is enough to sweeten a beverage, but people like to use teaspoons and tablespoons to measure things out, so they add a filler called maltodextrin. So I started measuring before and after consuming a drink that had like Splenda or aspartame or stevia or something, but also had maltodextrin. And I noticed that every single time there was maltodextrin in it, my blood sugar would actually spike after doing this. And you know, if you're somebody that works at a computer or like myself, you know, they're reading scientific papers all day long. Um, you know, it's very easy to just drink a lot of these artificially sweetened beverages and thinking, well, look, there's practically zero calories, so this couldn't be affecting me. And yet it was triggering this one sensor of mTOR and keeping mTOR turned on. So this was really eye-opening to me, and it was one of the things that I wanted to convey. Unfortunately, as we all know, biology is just incredibly complex, and I think nutrition has got to be one of the most complex health topics that we can talk about. And it's uh, it's easy to focus on one particular thing, and I did not want this book to sort of go off in every possible direction. Certainly, many very brilliant people have written about sugar and different fats, whether it's omega-6 and omega-3, omega-9, etc. So I didn't want to, you know, duplicate all this fine work that all these other people have done, but I wanted to bring their work into the relevance of mTOR especially. So I do talk about um, um, normal sucrose, which includes glucose, and its effect on turning on the switch, and basically saying, you know, the easiest thing to do for yourself is get a blood sugar monitor.
Right.
And if you're seeing in the morning that your blood sugar is, let's say, above 90, then chances are you didn't burn through your glycogen stores overnight the way you were hoping you were. And so something in your diet is raising your levels higher than it should be. So there's lots of ways to approach this. I prefer time restricting your diet, and we talk about that in the intermittent fasting chapter.
James, what about fruits? Which fruits do you like? Of course, berries are non-debatable, so everybody approves of berries. But what about the rest of the fruits, like oranges, apples, pineapples, mangoes? Do those turn on the switch?
So most of these common fruits, whether it be oranges or bananas, etc., are almost completely man-made in the sense that selective breeding over the course of 100 years has changed them so much that if you walk through a museum and notice still lifes that were done in the 17 and 1800s, and you look at a bowl of fruit, it practically looks unrecognizable. You're not sure, is that an orange or an apple, or like what are these balls that are in this bowl?
You are absolutely right. The fruits of today have nothing in common with the heirloom fruits and vegetables, by the way, while we're at it. You know, you look at an heirloom tomato versus a tomato of today, and there's just not that much in common. So please continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, in order to sell more products, the best strains of most of these fruits and vegetables are the ones that are sweeter. So they have more fructose, and they have been overgrown usually where they're being grown, so they lack the kind of nutrients that the soil would have carried, in a more Paleolithic time. So personally, I again think that it depends on your personal health. I think there's certainly lots of nutrients that are still available in fruits. If you focus more on organic, you'll probably get more out of it than if you go with the non-organic mass-produced fruits. I prefer personally berries, and so I like to have a wide variety of berries in my diet. I have noticed through years of practice that if I'm careful and I don't overconsume berries, it really has a negligible effect on my blood sugar levels. So if I want to be turning mTOR down and turning up autophagy, having a half cup or more of berries, especially earlier in the day when I need more energy, doesn't really affect me. Um, but I generally don't consume fruit. But I think I'm more probably insulin sensitive than other people, and I would just simply have higher and higher levels of insulin and higher levels of glucose in my bloodstream if I ate what an average person ate in terms of like fruit. And I would recommend everyone stay away from concentrated fruit, meaning apple juice, orange juice, other juices that lack all the fiber and basically have concentrated more of the sugar than anything else.
Absolutely. All right, in your next chapter, cutely labeled walnuts and corn-fed cows, you primarily dive into sort of the truth about fat. So what is the truth about eating fat for losing fat, fat to prevent Alzheimer's, dementia? And what I want to get into after that, of course, is cholesterol and people that have high cholesterol or heart issues. What do they do with your recommendation of eat more fat?
Well, studying longevity and chronic inflammation, which is a major problem in elderly people. One of the things I learned was a large source of inflammation is from these pro-inflammatory omega-6 oils. And again, when we study what do you find in primitive peoples that lived a more ancestral or Paleolithic type lifestyle, it's that their omega-6 to um, anti-inflammatory omega-3 levels were much more aligned than they are now. So they were somewhere between 4-to-1 and 1-to-1. And it depends on what part of the world and whether or not they were primarily eating fish, shellfish. If they were primarily eating fish and shellfish as a way of boosting their omega-3s. But what we find now is that around 1909, the levels of omega-6 to omega-3 were about 5-to-1. And in 1999, they were approximately 10-to-1. And now it's estimated that they're closer to 20-to-1. So the amount of omega-6 in our diet, which is a very pro-inflammatory fat in our body, this has just skyrocketed in just less than 100 years. So I wanted to bring this to the attention because if you're going to follow a ketogenic lifestyle, whether this is just temporarily to turn on autophagy or whether this is more long-term, so for example, to reduce your BMI to a healthy level, then I want people to know that there are healthier oils that they should be following. And the title, including walnuts, was when I started delving into omega-6, I was absolutely shocked and appalled by how much omega-6 there is per gram in some of the nuts that I was enjoying. So walnuts in particular, which have been touted for having lots of selenium and other nutrients that appear to be beneficial, they're extremely high in omega-6. Now, if you were substituting something really bad like trans fats or high saturated fatty acids, and you have a particular blood type or genetic type that makes that bad for you, then I think that substituting nuts, even high omega-6 nuts, for even worse oils, trans fats and saturated fats is probably going to work out for you. But there are healthy nuts, ones that have far lower omega-6 levels. And one of my favorites is the macadamia nut. And
Mine too. That's
it,
actually, I absolutely love macadamia nut. It's just unfortunate how high calorie it is, but oh, it is a good nut.
well, if you want to be on a ketogenic diet and you want to have primarily healthy monounsaturated fats, then you can practically live off of macadamia nuts. They're full of nutrients. Their oils are very uh, uh, benign in terms of causing inflammation and very low levels of saturated fat as well. So for those who are sensitive to saturated fat and dramatically raises their cholesterol, they don't have to worry so much about this with macadamia nuts. So it's been a primary tool for me to, if I just want to go keto, I just substitute some of my calories with macadamia nuts, and it's a super easy way and to me fairly delicious way of jumping into a keto lifestyle.
So do you do raw, sprouted, soaked, roasted? How do you take your macadamia nuts?
I vary back and forth between raw and roasted but not salted. One of the things in studying primitive, so-called primitive people and people that follow a sort of close to nature, close to the earth lifestyle, is that they have incredibly low levels of hypertension. And one of the things that's been linked to that is that they have extraordinarily low levels of salt in their diet because they're not adding salt to anything. So I've basically switched to eating whole natural foods and not pre-prepared foods that the manufacturer has added salt to it. And so when I have nuts, whether I'm having seeds like sunflower seeds or pumpkin seeds or almonds or macadamia nuts, I usually go for the roasted or raw, but totally unsalted. And it took a little bit of getting used to, but now the full flavor of the nut comes out, and I'm not really um, eating it for the salt flavor. And I think I'm actually enjoying it a lot more.
What about the conversation around phytates and anti-nutrients in nuts that have not been sprouted? Where do you come out on that?
So I've looked into this with lectins, with various pro-inflammatory proteins that are found elsewhere. These crystals that are in many plant foods, and I think that educating yourself about these and learning the tricks of how to avoid them or supplements to take that obviate the adversity in them. Uh, our friend Joe Mercola has recently written some really interesting material on this, and I'm following some of his recommendations. But basically, one of the things I do is I'm a self-quantifier, so I take a lot of blood tests. One of the things I love looking at is C-reactive protein, which kind of gives you a baseline inflammation level. It's turned on by pathogens, so it's also sort of an early warning system as to whether you've got a bad infection, whether bacterial or viral. It was actually discovered as an early warning system to tuberculosis. Um, but I use it to monitor my inflammation levels. And normally I'm well below 1.0. So I usually run between zero 0.8 or zero 0.5. And I
Wow.
noticed that when I cut out grains entirely, it went down to zero 0.2. But when I tried cutting out legumes, nothing happened. And when I eat legumes, it doesn't raise above that. So I think in my particular case, I'm seeing that it doesn't add any pro-inflammatory factors to my body. So I prefer to keep the nutrient side going, and it doesn't seem to cause indigestion. Um, I've discussed on numerous occasions with Dave Asprey about fiber. We've sort of been chatting back and forth for years about how much fiber are you up to now, and we're almost both exactly between 60 and 100 grams of fiber a day.
Wow, that's a lot of fiber. I'm assuming you're consuming that in some form of a supplement as well.
Most of it is supplemental, but I do consume about a pound of low glycemic vegetables a day, and I can do this even while on keto and stay in keto because they're very low glycemic, like Brussels sprouts and cauliflower, asparagus, things like that. And you can get a moderate level of fiber with that, but I've looked at different barks and other sources of fiber. Many of these are now put into products for leaky gut syndrome, and I'm a big fan of these types of fiber. I think larch bark is one of them, but inulin is a common one as well. I do know that in some people, they've told me that inulin raises their blood sugar. And I've experimented around myself, and it hasn't raised mine. But I think what you might look for is whether or not the inulin, which primarily comes from Jerusalem artichokes, I believe,
Mhm.
whether that's been, in a sense, adulterated. You know,
Right,
did they put other things into it?
exactly.
Um, and often I think those are the things that's actually increasing your blood sugar, not the fiber itself. But fiber makes really healthy fatty acids. So your gut bacteria in your lower colon make butyrates from this, and that's something that heals leaky gut syndrome and is generally good for the brain. Butyrates are involved in ketone production. So I'm a big fan of consuming lots of fiber. And of course, if you do this, your chance of getting colon cancer is going to be like dramatically lower as well.
What about psyllium husk?
I like making food, low glycemic muffins and things like that with psyllium husk. Again, there's some people that say that they get very bad indigestion. It makes their gut hurt. I don't know whether this is something they might get used to if they worked up to it, and
Right.
maybe they just jumped into it too much. But I think it's something that you have to see how your body adapts to, and then include it or try some of the other um, fiber types just to raise your level and see what works for you.
Absolutely. All right, the best chapter of them all, the last one, uh, finger pricks and grocery lists. All right, let's dive into your recommendations for living to a very, very long, healthy life, disease-free.
Well, one of the things that kind of surprised me when I started doing clinical trials with various physicians and talking to their patients, and often the patients were volunteering for these clinical trials because they had age-related ailments that they wanted to resolve, and they just wanted to live longer and healthier, was that very few of them um, ever got their blood tests done. So they would say, well, once a year I go to the doctor and he gives me a blood test. And I say, well, do you know what your blood glucose levels are? Well, my doctor said they were okay. Well, do you know what that means? Like, do you trust that they were an optimal? Like, if you really want to live long and you want to avoid certain kinds of maladies, and especially if you want to regulate this switch, you really need to know what your blood sugar levels are. And so they would say no. And often I would just say like, okay, come in tomorrow morning, and we'll give you a free blood test, and we'll see what your levels are. And often it would be over 100, and sometimes it would be over 110 or 120. And so they would actually be pre-diabetic or completely
Wow.
type 2 diabetic and not realize this, because the one day that they are going to go get their blood test, they do exactly what the doctor says, which is they stop eating at 6 o'clock, and they don't have, breakfast so that they can come into the office at 8 or 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning and then take their blood test, fasting. And I try and explain to them, this is actually what you want to do on a daily basis. this is how you should be eating. And if you measure yourself more, you'll find lots of other things that aren't exactly optimal, whether it might be your insulin levels, which again help regulate this particular switch, or your cholesterol levels, or your C-reactive protein levels, which show your inflammation, your immune levels, which you get from the CBC part of your blood test. So there's a wealth of information in that, and I would really urge people to get a full blood test at least twice a year, and to really look at um, your normal lifestyle,
Right.
and to, to try to discover whether these blood tests really represent your normal lifestyle, or whether you're doing something special for these blood tests that you go to the doctor with.
I also learned, James, from my own personal experience, that these tests have ranges. And just because you happen to be in the range doesn't necessarily mean that it's optimal. I also found that some of these ranges are outdated. Do you have a simple cheat sheet of, for being in this active switch turned off mode, what should certain numbers look like? So what should blood sugar look like? What should cholesterol look like? What should certain hormone like panels look like?
Well, again, the focus of the book is primarily just to teach people about this switch, so that they'll know how to regulate this in their lifestyle, whatever they choose to be, a vegan, a Western diet, paleo, etc. And you can regulate this switch in any of those diets as long as you know how it works. But I do think that a very useful tool is, of course, blood glucose. And there's other things, not just keeping mTOR always in this growth stage and never burning fat. I think those are super important issues. But one of the things that high blood sugar also does is it glycates the proteins that it comes in contact with. So if you want a quick example of what glycation is, look at a creme brulee. So there's this glassy, hard topping on the custard, which is made by simply melting sugar. And this melted sugar is glycated. Well, when you put sugar into your bloodstream, it glycates proteins in your bloodstream, including the very blood vessels themselves. So they get hard, like the top of a creme brulee, they get brittle, they form cracks, and then bacteria and things work their way into these cracks, and you end up with atherosclerotic plaques and other ruptures, and heart disease. So AGEs, as it's called, advanced glycation end products, conveniently AGE, these are very detrimental to the body. And if you keep your blood sugar levels down, then your chance of developing bad AGE syndrome is going to be lower. So one of the direct measurements of glycation, it's sort of an indirect measurement of your blood sugar over like a 3-month period, is called your hemoglobin A1C. But actually what this test measures is glycated proteins, hemoglobin proteins in this case, in your bloodstream. So this is a very direct measure of how much have you been glycating your bloodstream. And if it's above 5.5, then you're definitely having glucose levels in your bloodstream that are too high for too long on a daily basis. And so these tests are very important. Personally, I think cholesterol is very interesting. There are viewpoints all over the map as to whether more cholesterol is beneficial or detrimental. We see people who have mutations that have extraordinarily low total cholesterol. So it's a cholesterol receptor in the liver, and now there's drugs that knock out this cholesterol receptor in the liver. Repatha is one of these drugs, and it will dramatically lower your cholesterol. But when you look at populations around the world that have these genetic mutations, and they have total cholesterol of maybe 20, So not 120, not 2 or
Wow.
300, but double digits only. And
Wow.
you see, they not only are healthy, but there's almost no record of Alzheimer's or other dementia, which a lot of doctors have said, cholesterol is found in the brain. It's necessary to make hormone. So if you reduce your cholesterol levels, your hormones are going to go crazy, and you're not going to be able to uh, live without dementia. You don't see this in this group of normally cholesterol deficient individuals. So I think this area of what's the right amount of cholesterol is probably more governed by the size of the molecules, the particles, and how they're split among the different subsects of lipoproteins, and not specifically the total cholesterol number itself. I know lots of people who have had cholesterol levels of 2 to 300, no atherosclerosis whatsoever, and then people who have what would appear by most of the older standards, meaning that they had total cholesterol of maybe 120 and total cholesterol of 80 or 90, have severe enough atherosclerosis to have bypass surgery. So I think this is a difficult area. I don't know the answer to it. I actually have a clinical trial in an area that's related to this, that is exploring a completely different hypothesis, and I hope to be able to tell you about that in about a year. But for now, I think that the best thing is to sort of be safe and to keep your cholesterol within a moderate range, and do all these other healthy things. Because we certainly know that being diabetic, for example, being obese, dramatically increases your heart disease, even if your cholesterol is within the normal ranges. So I would get those things under control before getting really obsessed about your cholesterol levels.
And the first thing you recommend, of course, is intermittent fasting. You're a big fan of skipping breakfast and giving yourself sort of a 12-hour window. I think you talk about don't eat after 7 p.m. and then maybe your first meals at 11 a.m. That's doable, but you also talk about maybe fasting for 3 days. So what do you suggest as the ideal intermittent fasting schedule throughout the year?
I think this varies from person to person. So there's some caveats. Young kids probably shouldn't fast or do this intermittent fasting. If you're pregnant, you definitely shouldn't be worried about MTOR at that period of time. You really want all these growth hormones and stuff being fed to your baby. And if you have severe health problems, you should probably go to your doctor and tell them about what you think you want to do, and make sure that they're in agreement that this is a healthy thing to try. But if you're over 25 and you're a moderately healthy person and concerned about longevity, I think that cutting your eating window down to about 8 hours or 6 hours is a absolutely excellent step. And it's actually really easy to do. So there was a paper that just came out 2 days ago. It was either published the last day of 2019 or very early in 2020. Rafael de Cabal was the main author of the paper, and it was about intermittent fasting utilizing either a 6 hour or 8 hour eating window. And they showed really remarkable improvements in health in elderly people. And it's just not that hard to do.
I'm
So
doing it
I would,
earlier in the day, so it wouldn't be the same if you were doing fasting from like, I don't know, 1 p.m. till 9 p.m. Really, the goal is to do it in the morning and not eat after 7 p.m. because you've done some clinical research that shows that the way our body processes sugar and carbs, etc., is a lot more optimized during the day than it is during the evening hours, correct?
that's right. Both plants and animals are very geared towards cyclic cycles based on the sun and the moon. And we have these daily rhythms. And so in humans' case, you know, following this where you eat, say around 11 o'clock in the morning and you stop eating around 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening falls in perfectly with the normal kind of um, cycles that we evolved to experience and have been shown over numerous studies to be very important to health and actually tied in quite strongly to cancer when they're dysregulated.
All right, let's end with the switch plan. And you talk, of course, it's a 1 year plan that's ongoing for the rest of your life till you get to 117, which is, I think, the age of the last eldest person that we know of. So you talk about 8 months and 4 months, right? So you're cleaning 4 months. So talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go in deeper into your plan.
So based on the fact that in, in most of the planet, humans were exposed to different seasons and had different nutritional abilities during that time. So for example, in the summer is when the grains would ripen, fruit would ripen, honey would be more prevalent because the bees would have been making it from the flowers. Um, this is a time when your body typically had these high energy carbohydrates available and you built up muscle, stem cells, your immune system, and fat reserves for the long winter that you were about to endure. And in some places, the winter is basically a drought season. So even when it doesn't necessarily turn cold, in many parts of the world, in the winter, they have a long period of drought. And so things also become restricted. So based on how we evolved, I thought it was probably most appropriate that we try and follow that with our lifestyle. Various groups like the Mount Athos monks, which I talk about, they fast for about 50% of the time, 180 days out of the year. And it's a calorie restricted type of fast.
Like a Dr. Longo's fast.
Yeah, very similar to that rather than a water fast, for example. And they do prolonged fasts as well. So I think that this can be incorporated in people's lifestyles on a annual or semi-annual basis also. But I do think that looking at this as wanting to pick one of these lifestyles, whether it's a paleo diet, a vegan diet, a Mediterranean diet, etc. Even an Okinawan high plant fish-based diet, I think you can pick something that works for you and then follow that at least 8 months out of the year, and then for 3 or 4 months out of the year, you can sort of loosen up, eat more carbohydrates, have sort of more feast than normal. And, if you want to work these time periods in, you could literally do it 6 days on, 1 day off, or you could do it 4 weeks on, 1 week off. I think there's lots of ways that you could cycle back and forth, but I think the majority of the time, maybe 80, 80-20 or 8 months on, 4 months off, this sort of thing, that you should be in this catabolic autophagy activating state overnight at least. And occasionally, maybe once or twice a year, with autophagy turned on for 3 or 4 days in a row. And for that, you probably are going to have to really restrict your proteins for that many days, or just do a total fast for that many days.
Got it. Now, in your plan, in your food plan, you say healthy fats, and of course, your favorite again is macadamia, avocado, MCT, olive. 65 to 75% of the calories need to come from fat. And then you've got the low glycemic vegetables, which is, again, you say 7 days a week, not an issue. That's 10 to 25%, which is Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, spinach, broccoli, squashes. Vegetable proteins, not to exceed 10%. And that's hemp, pea, macadamia nuts, vegan only, fatty fish, dairy and meat. And then of course you go into alcohol, 1 to 2 drinks, sweets, grains, legumes, starches, nuts, only during fall. What's up with that? Why during fall are you limiting us with the sweets, grains, legumes, starches, and nuts?
So the sort of food pyramid that I made is really oriented towards this absolutely optimal diet based on what we've learned from these very long-lived, healthy people. So there's been lots of studies, I think 30 or more studies done on Loma Linda vegans, entire programs of studies, the Okinawan Research Group, who have been studying the centenarians and supercentenarians in Okinawa now for many decades, and recent work on centenarians in Italy, Greece, and Mount Athos in particular. So when we look at these groups, they follow this diet that I've proposed in this food pyramid. And so really that is the basis for, if you just want to pick one thing and do it, this would be very close to ideal. And again, you want to make sure you're cycling mTOR off and on. You can't just pick one particular thing and say, this is it, it's healthy, I'm going to do this the rest of my life, and have no variation in it. Variation is how we evolved, and it's very important to turning this switch off and on.
How do I know if my mTOR is turned on or off? Is there any quick and dirty back of the envelope test?
We're actually, so I have a laboratory of my own, an analytical laboratory primarily here in Gainesville, Florida. I just moved here from Los Angeles. I've got several PhDs working with me. We have a really beautiful mass spectrometer from which we can measure protein levels from blood and intracellular levels of protein. So one of the things we're doing now is looking at mTOR 1 and 2. Those are the complexes that make up mTOR. And we're trying to develop whether or not there's an easy test to see whether mTOR is inhibited or activated. Right now, I think the best way to know that you have it activated is to take lots of leucine and make sure that your glycogen stores are full. This is mTOR. If you want to know that autophagy is activated and mTOR is inhibited, then you want to severely reduce your animal proteins and reduce your high energy carbohydrates. And if your blood sugar in the morning is less than 90, chances are really good that you're now in this catabolic state. So that's sort of the shortcut that we can use right now to know whether or not we're in or out of this switch.
Got it. Got it. And you also, of course, recommend 3 consecutive days of fasting every quarter. I can do a day of fasting. 3 consecutive days is a lot. Are you saying water fasts, or talk about the 3 consecutive days? What are the parameters?
I think a lot more research needs to go into this, but certainly the research that's been done primarily in these prolonged fasts do show that it's very beneficial. And I think that doing this at least a few times a year, it really turns on a deeper version of autophagy than you would get with simply the overnight fasts. And again, thinking back to how we evolved, humans didn't have constant food supplies, not until very recently. So it was probably quite common throughout human history to go even weeks, if not months, of very low calorie availability, so very high amounts of restriction, or just water alone. And it's been shown to be very beneficial. People have done 1 year straight water fasts. Now you have to have a lot of body fat to do that, but just to give you an example, and I talk about this in the book, you're a 20 BMI healthy 20-year-old of 150 pounds. So that's a very healthy person, a BMI of 20%. Um, this person would have about 135,000 calories worth of fat in their body.
Right,
So you could go 60 days without eating anything
right.
and burning thousands of calories a day just from the fat that you carry around alone. Now, you do also need proteins, and that's why um, I'm not recommending that people do really long, extended fasts without a doctor recommending it and supervising it, because you really need to make sure you're getting enough proteins so that your body doesn't basically break down all of your proteins um, in order to continue to make your cells function properly. So this won't happen in a short 2 or 3 day fast. Um, and that's why you can get the benefits of these deeper uh, autophagy periods by doing those fasts, but not risk any kind of detriment to your muscles and immune system and that sort of thing by keeping them turned off for so long.
What about someone who's on the thinner side? What about someone with a BMI of, I don't know, 10? Do you recommend similar intermittent fasting and consecutive day water fasts for them too? And especially when it comes to women, what about hormones? Any research on that?
I think that, again, uh, this is an area that has not really been explored, especially taking into consideration this metabolic switch. But what I'd like to suggest is that you can take a higher calorie um, lifestyle with following a ketogenic diet and still both suppress mTOR and turn on autophagy and also upregulate mTOR and turn on this growth and rebuilding process, all while staying in a higher calorie, moderate protein diet. And so I would say that people who already are thin, maybe they're not very muscular and don't want to lose any more muscle. First of all, they should probably talk to their doctor about, a proposal of doing something like this. But I think they'd want to look at the ketogenic diet as a way of keeping their calories up, not becoming innervated and have loss of energy, loss of muscle, not have sufficient proteins to make their organs work correctly,
Right.
lose hormones, etc. So I would caution people that um, more of something is not always beneficial. You can't say, you know, I heard James Clement say that fasting turns on autophagy, so I'm going to do a water fast for the rest of my life. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that you need to cycle back and forth. You need to get the best health benefits out of having mTOR turned on and the best health benefits on having it suppressed and autophagy turned on.
Fantastic. James, this has been so enlightening. Thank you so much for writing this book. Any single one piece of advice for someone who's listening and watching, and of course, at this point, feeling overwhelmed with all the information and saying, God, I got to rewind and listen to this all over again. What is the one thing that you want them to take away from our conversation, but also from the book that you've written?
I think understanding that virtually all life that we know has this anabolic catabolic switch, and that it is crucial to human health and longevity, and that you need to know enough about it so that whether you're shopping in the grocery store or a friend is just telling you about the latest new diet craze, you can evaluate it with this knowledge and say, that might be interesting to try for a month, but I want mTOR turned on or I want autophagy turned on, and that diet won't work, to go in or out of those stages. And that's the one thing I want people to remember when they hear about something a year or 2 years from now, is sort of always to know about this one metabolic switch that they have to keep control of and cycle back and forth.
Fantastic. Thank you so much again. And for the rest of you, come to healcircles.org, nonprofit completely committed to you and your health. Ad-free, sponsor-free, vendor-free, manipulation-free. I hope we'll see you on healcircles.org. James, thank you so much again. We'll see you hopefully soon when you finish writing your next book.
Pleasure talking with you, Rena. Thanks so much.